Welcome to the College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line. Here's Shehan J. Haraja and Bobak Hayeri.
Hey everybody, it's the College Football Survivor Show. I'm Bobak Hayeri with my co-host Shehan J. Haraja, national college football writer for CBS Sports. We are glad to have you with us, as always. So we're going to take a look at the results of Week 10 as we try to figure out who stays on Survivor Island. And then, it's a big week in college football. The first CFP rankings come out this week on Tuesday. They're maybe not the only thing happening on Tuesday, but for our purposes, college football is supreme. We'll be talking about what we think our biggest questions are going to be heading into this first show, because it's the first time we've had a 12-team playoff. The questions are going to be a little different than when we had 4 teams. Plus, we'll also have a reaction show ready for you guys on Wednesday morning to our reactions to those playoff rankings that come out on Tuesday night. But before we dive into today's episode, let me remind you that you can find us on X and TikTok at CFP Survivor Show, where we have video highlights of the show, run polls, and listen to your feedback. Please take a moment to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. So, Sean, first of all, how are you doing? You had a fun weekend. You went to one of the interesting games that ended up being completely one-sided.
Yeah, I was at SMU versus Pitt. It was kind of the big prove it game for both teams, and one team proved it, and that was SMU. It's funny. It was like from halfway through the first quarter, because this game honestly took forever, if I'm being honest, like being in the stands, being in the stadium. And like it was just from the opening whistle. Like SMU just jumped over Pitt in every single aspect of the game. I think Pitt ended up scoring like 23 points or something like that, but all of it was in garbage time. It was, I think, 34-3 when Pitt started scoring points. And look, I mean, you start looking now, and SMU, of course, they have that loss to BYU that we thought was really bad at the beginning of the year, but maybe isn't all that bad anymore when you look at what BYU's done since then. And they've got a pretty manageable path ahead after crushing Pitt the way they did, Boston College at Virginia versus Cal. I think we might have to have a conversation at least about this team.
Absolutely. I mean, we saw some teams fall by the wayside. I'll just quickly, as we kind of go to the first part of this show, it's always good to talk about how the format works here on the College Football Survivor Show. So the way we work is we have a 12-team island, maximum 12 teams. Every week, no matter what, we have to vote a team off the island. Now, last week, we were in a bit of a pickle because, all the teams won, so we had to pick one. And we did. We singled out Ohio State, knowing that there was going to be a pretty big deciding game against Penn State, last weekend. So if all the teams win, it gets tricky. But this week, we've got some teams to choose from. But after we vote teams off, or a team, we vote teams that might be added to the island, up to a maximum of 12 total on the island. Now, with the 12-team playoff, we have some certain requirements we've added. We're trying to follow what the 12-team bracket's going to look like. So there's guaranteed spots for the conference champion, or at least one team from every P4 conference. And we have to have at least one G5 team. Now, if we remove one of those, all of those, we have to have at least one member of each of those conferences. And we have a few for most of them. Now, if the G5 is a team that's voted off, we've added a special rule that we still have to look at the other 11 teams to find someone, just so that we don't find ourselves consistently picking on the G5, which, to be fair, we really have not this entire season. We've been doing this show, under this format for, we're well past halfway point. That really hasn't been a problem, thankfully. Now, teams can always play their way back on the island. Some teams that we've been talking about before in the horizon may have accidentally played themselves off of it. Maybe Kansas State and Pittsburgh. We're probably not going to be talking about you guys for a long time at this point. But the teams we had heading into Week 10, again, these are the teams we were selecting from. We had Oregon, which had no problem at Michigan. We had Georgia, which had an interesting game against rival Florida in the world's largest, the game they don't like to call the world's largest outdoor cocktail party. Penn State lost we'll talk about this game. They lost Ohio State. Miami had no trouble against Duke and their former head coach. Texas picked a good week to have a bye. Tennessee beat Kentucky 28-18. BYU had BYE, so they took a little break this week. Texas A&M lost pretty big at South Carolina. We'll probably be talking about that one. And Clemson also lost to Louisville. We'll probably be talking about that one as well. Oh, and the team they were tied with last week in the AP poll, Iowa State, also lost to Texas Tech at home. So again, teams we're going to be discussing. Indiana, which had no trouble against Michigan State after after a 10-0 start, they finished 47-10. And then Boise State took care of San Diego State. So those were our 12 teams, several of which have lost. So all of that said, before we dive into it, what were your thoughts of our survivor pool? How did you think they did overall this week?
Not great. I think that this is one of those times and one of those weeks, right, where like you're just like, you look back last week and you're like, why couldn't one of you guys have lost last week to make our job just a little bit easier? Instead, we had to kick off a team that we felt pretty good about. Now we have multiple teams that very well could be kicked off instead. I will say, right, so you look at the field that we have right now, and this isn't just, hey, again, last week we kicked off a team as sort of a short-term punishment. That team, of course, being Ohio State, who I imagine will be back on this week. I think that's a pretty safe bet. But now you're in a position where all of a sudden, you have to start looking at long-term path. It's not just a short-term thing. So for example, Clemson has been on our board. Well, suddenly they're behind not just Miami, but also SMU in the chase for a conference championship. You start looking at a team like Iowa State. Well, Iowa State all of a sudden, they're way behind BYU. Their at-large case is potentially gone after losing their first game of the season. So that's what makes it so complicated, I think, is we just have to start looking, especially entering the month of November, at not just the short term, but also the long-term path for all of these teams.
Yeah, I mean, Clemson's an interesting case because we had this a little bit with Texas after they dropped that game to Georgia. We kind of looked back at their schedule and thought, you know what? Michigan wasn't that great. ULM, well, now they're not great either. But at the time we were joking, ULM might be one of the best teams they played. We look at Clemson, again, they lost pretty handily to Georgia. That was a team that was a game that made us all kind of disregard them until they were making noise. The offense seemed to find their way. They definitely climbed back up. NC State, which was looking pretty bad early in the season, Stanford, Florida State, which obviously talked ad nauseum about them. Wake Forest, was Virginia the best team they beat? And then Louisville comes in, and Louisville, yeah, they're, again, they already took several losses at this point, but at the same time, you looked at the way they lost, they weren't really out of those games. And my goodness, now you can't help but wondering, okay, Clemson really actually isn't all that repaired. It just, they had a team's easier than Georgia and easier than Louisville is what it feels like, because that was a striking game.
They just beat bad teams. And so, I think an interesting way to look at it is this too, right? So we had 4 teams from our 12 lose, I believe. So I think that certainly this week, I would say that multiple need to be kicked off. And I think that the number one team, though, that probably hurt their chance. Actually, there are 2 teams that I want to pull out of that group that I think hurt their chances more than anybody. And I want to talk about them for a second. One is Texas A&M. Texas A&M was in a position where if they just go in and don't mess up all the way through their game against Texas, and they can lose that game against Texas, no problem, then they're in. They're 10-2 in the SEC. They have a win over LSU. They are in. They did the only thing that they can't do. They went on the road and not just lost to South Carolina, they lost by 20 points. 20 points against South Carolina. And now, South Carolina is not a bad team. They'll probably be a 7 or 8 win team. I think that they've impressed at times this year. They've had chances to win some games that they didn't win. But that's not the kind of performance that you should be having as a potential college football playoff team. And look, when we get into the second half of the show, I actually want to touch a little bit on the SEC's at-large race, because it's one of the more interesting dynamics that we have right now. But the other team that I want to touch on as well is Clemson. Like, Clemson was in a great position, regardless of whether they won the tiebreaker or not, to make the conference championship game, to have a chance to make the playoff. Because they were a 1-loss team. Their 1 loss was to Georgia, like you mentioned. But if you win these games, if you beat Louisville last week, if you beat Pitt in a couple weeks, like you're in good position. Now they don't even control their own destiny to head to the ACC title game. And that doesn't even get into the fact that if you look at them play right now, they are playing worse than SMU and Miami in their own conference. And by the way, we're not even confident that the ACC is going to get a second team in the first place. So to me, I think that those are the two teams that right away, right now, I could say they should not be in our field anymore. I think that their paths got very hard. Now, Texas A&M can play their way in by beating Texas, but that's what they have to do. I don't think they have any pathway to the playoff other than going and beating Texas in one of the biggest rivalry games of the year.
Yeah, they have a safe opportunity to get to that game without any additional losses. They're playing New Mexico State. Thankfully, Diego Pavia is obviously now in Vanderbilt and at Auburn, which I don't even know what to make of Auburn right now. But Vanderbilt had no trouble with them. So again, Diego Pavia, but that might be the Hugh Fees connection. That's a whole other conversation. But that game at Texas. So I think for now, though, they really don't have a path. Clemson's also, by the way, Texas A&M, it's also interesting, too. It was a fascinating game because for all the buzz after that upset of LSU, and I think it was an upset at the time, and it was a tight game, excitement, the whole shebang. People were like, watch out for the South Carolina game. I mean, it was said so much so that I believe they were only favored by 2.5. A close game would have been something, but yeah, South Carolina absolutely just took care of business. I mean, they won by 24 points, and it was not a good game for the Aggies, and it was a complete. The sad thing is, too, if you know anything about our friends in Aggie Nation, Aggie Land, this was like a weird repeat of every season they ever have with the roller coaster train. One of those wonderful memes that came from, I believe, Two Jones. I forgot the username, but over at Texas Ags, I believe, who came up with that brilliant story of how they do it. And it was just a repeat. And that, again, that's problematic because it really hurts the faith I have in that team quite a bit. So could they get back in? Yeah, but talk to us when you beat Texas. Now, Clemson, again, I agree. They're now so far behind. It is just completely cast a pall over their entire, body of work between the Georgia game to now. I'm not even sure, like, you're right. Like, are they even going to get like Pitt? That's the only team. And Pitt's also suffering that too. When you lose the way you do to SMU, suddenly the luster's off Pitt. And it's kind of like, all right, there's that team every year. We were wondering if Indiana was that team. They don't seem to be it. But Pitt seems to be that team that starts out with a great run, undefeated. And everyone's kind of like, they seem like they're not quite the team we think they are. And if that's all Clemson has, it's going to be a tough bit. I mean, yeah, they got to play South Carolina, which, who knows? South Carolina is just a team you don't want to play. They're not necessarily going to be in the playoff, but they're just a team you don't want to play. I have a hard time seeing Clemson. So I think both of those are safe bets to vote off the island. I think we put them both to our followers on X. What did they say?
Yeah, that's a good question. So like you mentioned, we put up a poll of all of 4 different teams to be potentially voted out of our field. We put Clemson, we put Texas A&M, we put Iowa State, and we put Penn State. So the number one team that was voted off by far was the 1-2 loss team. That's Clemson. 46.9%. It was a pretty strong plurality. Texas A&M was second by a margin of 23.1% to 22.7% over Iowa State. So that's how close we were talking. Now, I will say, what are your thoughts on Iowa State? Because Iowa State did lose.
Yeah, that's a great transition because Iowa State is in its own pickle right now because the Big 12 is, first of all, it's awesome. We keep saying that week after week, and it got even more awesome this week because we said Willie Fritz is a good head coach, but to see him to take out Kansas State to the shock and awe of everyone. I mean, first of all, they're going to be terrifying in a couple of seasons. Everyone now can see that. But all of that said, it just messed up the entire race because right now, I believe, obviously, BYU is the leader in the clubhouse because they're undefeated. Iowa State is tied with Colorado for the race for second place. And at this point, I don't know who could win out. It really, I mean, Colorado obviously is a fun team. We've all been talking about quietly. Deion's made them interesting. They have 2 losses, but again, one of them was out of conference to Nebraska, a rivalry game. I really am not sure what to make. I don't think The question is now with the tiebreakers are apparently really confusing in the Big 12. Nothing new there. I'm really curious to know, can they make it all the way? I don't know. I don't think they're in the same boat as Clemson, where they really have kind of fallen far behind. And I also don't know if I have as much faith in Colorado to say, oh yeah, they're going to just pencil them in. They're not going to win out, and this is going to be completely their schedule to have. Because that's, to me, when I look at Iowa State, I have to look at them against that. I'd say, gosh, which team has a harder schedule? I'm looking, by the way. So Colorado, they got at Texas Tech, which has been a nightmare this season. They're not necessarily as good as they thought they were going to be, but they're better than we thought they were at the beginning. Utah, at Kansas. And I love the hard finale that Colorado had. Utah at Kansas and Oklahoma State. Boy, now they get to, so they end with the worst teams in the conference. Who thought that one? And then meanwhile, Iowa State, Kansas, Cincinnati, Utah, Kansas State. Boy, I don't know. I mean, at this point, I think either of those teams, the only path they have to the playoff is winning the conference title game. And my question is, do I think either of them can do it?
So let me stop you for 1 second, okay? So to go to the Big 12 tiebreakers for just 1 minute. The top tiebreaker, of course, is head-to-head. These two teams do not play against each other this season. The second one, though, could actually get interesting. Win percentage against all common conference opponents among the tied teams. So what that means is that there are two games that could decide this. One is, or two opponents, let's say. One is Kansas State. Colorado lost earlier this year against Kansas State. But the other one, and the way that Colorado can play themselves back in, is they play Texas Tech this week. If they beat Texas Tech, then those two teams would only have one loss combined against their common opponents. So then all of a sudden, you go to the next tiebreakers, which would be win percentage against the next highest placed common opponent in the conference standings. And that's actually where things get interesting, because then you're in a position where it depends who finishes with the higher record, Kansas State or Texas Tech. If Texas Tech finishes ahead of Kansas State and Colorado beats Texas Tech, that would mean Colorado goes. If Texas Tech finishes with a worse record than Kansas State, that would mean Iowa State goes. And by the way, this is dependent on both of them winning the games in front of them. So it's a little confusing. And really, I mean, the short answer is we don't have enough information at this time to make a final determination on who's going to go. But here's the thing that I'll say about Iowa State, or I'll say two things. One, this is why you can't put yourself in this position to where you're now begging for a tiebreaker. And I think you're right. I think that they're in a position right now where they probably need to win the conference in order to make the playoff. Now, I still think they're in good shape overall to make the conference title game and potentially win the conference, but it makes it a lot tougher. I'm going to say hold on them right now. I'm going to say let's not kick them out right this second, but the way that this might change is we're going to evaluate some teams to vote in. And if we figure out a third team we want to have in, like, that might be curtains for them right now.
Yeah, I think that's the way to do it. I would rather see who we're considering to put and who we're considering to put and who we might put to replace them. That would be my biggest concern as well. You know, I just have to say, Commissioner Brett Yormark, because we hope you're listening to the show. If you get into a situation where you've got two one-loss teams like this, do like some kind of webinar or something, or like YouTube, where you bring like the most, you know, photogenic professor you have among your Big 12 schools to come out and like go through all of these steps in like a web broadcast. And I guarantee you it's going to be a hit. People will tune in for that especially if you make it like a 10-minute broadcast, not like some bloated thing. People would love that. At least the press would, and we'll tell everybody about it. So I mean, I think that would be a fantastic.
They did just release, because I got like 7 emails about it. They did just release their list of like professors that they're honoring, one from each school. So I think that that's a perfect opportunity for them to come in and be like, look, who is let's have a competition. Let's figure out who comes up with the best and most streamlined video to come in and explain which teams are still alive in your conference. Now, of course, I'm a little biased. Maybe you should go with Dr. Stephen Sloan, who was the history professor from Baylor, who was named Big 12 Faculty Member of the Year. Nice. I don't know. There's lots of options out there.
Well, if we're talking about film production, it's too bad you guys don't have USC in the conference. That's all I got to say. Then you're going to get something that's going to look like, wow, I didn't even know you could make a shot like that. Anywho.
Yeah, that's a good question.
They should just make it random draw. It's going to be some guy from like the art department that's major, like that teaches sculpture. It's like,
I will say Arizona State does have the Cronkite School of Journalism. They know how to put together a production. So it'll be a great battle. That's how that's what we can do with our faculty spotlight members.
Indubitably. Hey, BYU has a whole TV station, so why not just hand it to them?
Oh, that's true. That's true. They probably already have that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think then we're going to hold pause on Iowa State. Now, we still should discuss Penn State because my favorite comment I read about the results of Ohio State, again, 20-13 over Penn State, is we've reached the stage where this game could have been an email. I mean, it just was exactly what we had year after year after year. I mean, why did we all show up to this? Our producer went out of his way to go down to that game, and all we got was the exact same game we got before. What do we make of this? I mean, I think I'll say tentatively, I think this is the kind of close loss, a number 3 versus number 4. I hesitate to drop a one-loss team that's only loss is against Ohio State. But what do you make of it?
So here's the deal, is that nothing changed for Penn State. Nobody realistically thought that they were ever going to win that game. Like it was a battle of two teams that don't like to beat good teams, but Penn State, if you go down into the mud, Penn State is going to win because they're just so used to losing games like this. They're experts at it. Ohio State is still new to the grind. But the reality is, it doesn't matter. Like, it doesn't make any difference. They are going to win out. They're going to beat Washington at Purdue, at Minnesota versus Maryland. They're going to finish 11-1. They're going to roll to the most underwhelming 11-1 season in the country. They're going to have 0 quality wins on their schedule. It's not going to matter, and they're going to.
Hey, Pitt could win out. Pitt could win out.
No, they it's not that they can win out. It's that they're going to win out. They're going to be favored heavily in all their games.
But we're talking about the most uninspired one with lost team. I'm like, there's some other candidates out there. We'll see.
I would be much more excited by Louisiana getting to 11-1 than I would be by Penn State getting to 11-1. But the other thing too is that so Split Zone Duo, the other great college football podcast, they have a running bit that they've been doing since July, maybe even June, and their bit is Penn State is just right on track to become the first team to ever lose a home playoff game, and they are right on track for that. They are going to be the number 6 or number 7 seed. They're going to lose to number 10, and everybody's going to be like, I don't know what that was. What was that all about? So I will be I will be a little nicer for a second. Like, I think that Ohio State is just such a tough battle. There's a reason that they were my preseason national title pick. There's a reason that they're still my midseason national title pick. I know I had multiple colleagues at that game at Penn State, Ohio State, and the issue just still remains. They don't have wide receivers that can get any separation on anybody. Like, Drew Aller actually played pretty dang well, and I think that Andy Kotelnicki has added a major component to that offense, but like, you can't be an elite team in college football in 2024 and not have 2 elite receivers. Like, you just can't. It's not how the game works anymore. And especially when you're playing against a team like Ohio State that was able to change the game with one play. When you talk about teams like Texas that can change a game with one play, Oregon has receivers that can change a game with one play. Like, that's the toughest part of this for me, is that I just can't take them super seriously as a national championship team without them fixing that. at the same time, that's not really the question that we have right now. They're going to be in the playoff. They're going to be 11-1. Nothing changed. So obviously they still deserve to be in the field right now.
Now I absolutely want Ohio State just to go through, win the Big Ten championship game, just so that through the way it gets stacked, Penn State gets through their first round game and has to play Ohio State. And you're just going to hear a collective groan out of everyone, including in Columbus, because it's like eventually they're going to theoretically pull one of these off. But my goodness. That might like oh, brother. So we should. Do you agree that we should probably still keep Penn State then?
Yeah, no, we should right now. Now I'm real quick pulling up the bracket that our Brad Crawford over at CBS Sports has put together. I'm just curious where he has Penn State. He has them number 8. Oh man, this would be something. He has them number 8 hosting Indiana, who would be number 9.
Gosh.
So I think that would be.
It's not a rematch. That's good.
No, it's not a rematch. It would be Big Ten on Big Ten, but it would not be. It would not be that. So you know what? Let's see it happen. Let's see Penn State lose to Indiana. And I've always said Penn State is the Big Ten's good team Mendoza line, and I think Indiana might be pretty dang good. So that might be enough.
That is fantastic. So we've now eliminated 2 teams, with one kind of sitting on the edge, on the precipice with Iowa State. We've got to figure out who we could put back in if we have to put back in. We're not required to add teams, but there are some good candidates there. Goes without saying, Ohio State, we didn't even put you up to a vote. We said this is almost contingent. Whoever wins that, if you win that game, you're in. If you lose that game, then we were being prescient and we were right to not believe in you. Clearly we were wrong. What do you make of Ohio State after that game?
Yeah, I mean they are who we thought they were. I think that they have some issues on the offensive line that make me concerned about them as a title team, but they are now, to me, short of losing, let's say, to Michigan in their final regular season game, which I don't think is likely. And they do play Indiana. That's going to be a little bit of a tricky game, but I think that, I mean, frankly, I think that they probably could lose that game and still be okay after beating Penn State on the road. Now, that's not a place that I want to be. I think that they probably should go ahead and beat Indiana at home if they want to give themselves a good chance. But, they are far more likely now than they were before to make the college football playoff. They certainly deserve to be back into our field. And again, like when you go on the road and beat a top 5 team, even if, top 5 is a little species for a Penn State team that I don't think has played at a top 5 level, like you still did it. You're going to get credit for that. And still, their only loss this season was a 1-point loss to the number 1 team in the country on the road. So I think that they're fine. I think they deserve to be back in.
They seem to do a good job. Obviously they've had to move around the line a bit, and losing Josh Simmons was a big one, and something we discussed a lot before. They seem to have found Jackson seems to have been the person for that spot, at least for now, to keep that offense moving.
Yeah, and there's a couple pieces to this, right? There were 2 or 3 times where they put Donovan Jackson on an island against Abdul Carter, and he got whipped. Like there's a reason that guys have certain body types sometimes. And, again, the difference between a guard and a tackle is that a tackle has to be able to be out in space and a guard can kind of just keep pushing forward. And like, they're not going to get Simmons level left tackle play. They're just not right now. But I think that the combination of Jackson playing tackle, and they also have put a tight end on that side. They've also chipped with the running back. I think the combination of those things is going to put them in an okay enough situation. And the other thing that I'll mention too, because I think I mentioned this on the last show, is they were much better in 3rd and 4th and short situations against Penn State than they have been the previous couple of weeks. I mentioned the stat last week. They are bottom 10 in the country in conversion rate on 3rd or 4th and 2 or less. Well, this past week against Penn State, a really good defense, they were much more efficient getting those. I remember 2 or 3 of those that they converted in that game. So I think that they're going to be okay on the offensive line, but I mean, they really benefit from at least getting their backup left tackle back, even if they're not going to get their starter back.
So looking at some of the other teams we want to consider. So we've put Ohio State in. That takes care of one of the two we removed. So we've at least one more open space, potentially another if we find someone we think is more compelling than Iowa State. Some of the teams we've discussed that we haven't put in, but we've been kind of on the fence week after week. One of which is Notre Dame, who, as a reward for their bye week, fell 2 spots in the AP poll. Now, granted, they were really hoping that Texas A&M win was going to look great, and that was not what they needed to see happen. And they also, of course, have that awful win, probably awful loss to NIU, and then they're not going to be able to get much bounce off of beating a Florida State team that everyone other than Cal seems to have had no trouble with. LSU, which against also had a bye, and then they may have an interesting game because the other team they're playing is another team we could talk about too, Alabama. Both Alabama and LSU have had bye weeks. They both have got 2 losses. That's going to be an interesting one with Alabama heading into Death Valley. That could be a potential play-in game for at least our survivor pool. So we could perhaps maybe say we'll look at them, put them on reserve for next week. SMU, certainly with one loss to BYU, put on a hell of a performance, in front of your very eyes against Pittsburgh on a team on the ACC networks. Not as many of us got to see it. And then, I'm just going to mention Colorado. I mean, they're not quite ready to be in the pool yet, but we've had a little discussion about them. And again, I also don't think they're ready yet. They're going to get a game against Notre Dame eventually, but Army, man, with a backup quarterback, their star quarterback was out, was able to have no problem with Air Force. But again, a lot of people have not had trouble with Air Force, 20-3. So all of that said, are there some teams there you think would be worth discussing to be added in?
So I think that it's an interesting question. So Notre Dame has been one that we've gone back and forth on for the past couple of weeks and months. And I think what's interesting about them is like their path is probably fine. This is going to be a team that we learn a lot about with the first rankings that come out on Tuesday. Because look, if they're 13, then they might be in trouble. But if they're like 8, then I feel like they're pretty much locks, right? Like they do play Army, but they played Navy really well. And I do think that Army's probably a little better than Navy, but I mean, they have proven that they can defend the option is really what you're getting at, right? So then if they handle Army, it's like they really shouldn't even struggle in any of their games ahead. They should be 11-1. I think an 11-1 team that at least has the win over Texas A&M puts himself into the field. I think that their case got a little worse with Texas A&M losing, less because it devalues that, but more because you have essentially a head-to-head against an SEC at-large team in that scenario, right? Like a 10-2, most likely SEC at-large team. And so if Texas A&M is more like 17 than they are 9, that I think hurts your case just a little bit because Texas A&M set essentially a little bit of a floor for how far you can fall. I think that's maybe gone now, but I tend to lean towards Notre Dame getting in. Now, I'll quickly touch on SMU, who is very much alive in the ACC title race. They are favored to make it they play a game in Charlotte, I think, right? To play.
Yeah, they do. And the rest of their schedule's manageable.
Yes.
They got BC, which has been kind of all over the place, at Virginia.
Yes.
And then they have their longtime rival Cal in the finale.
Of course.
I love, by the way, Cal plays that after the big game. Like the big game is the week before. I can't get over that. Anyway.
it's something else, man. But I think that like, so SMU's in good position to make it. The question I think becomes like with SMU, you can kind of compare a little bit SMU versus Iowa State in terms of their spot in the field. Because, SMU has a really good loss. They lost to BYU, a team that I think will probably look pretty good when the first rankings are released on Tuesday. Whereas Iowa State has an okay loss. Like Texas Tech is not a bad loss, but it's not a good loss either. They don't have any quality wins as yet. That's the tough thing for Iowa State, but they do have the opportunity to go acquire more quality wins with the game against Kansas State late in the year. So I go back and forth on this. I think that both have to win their conference to do it. I don't think that either has an at-large case, because that would involve losing in a conference title game and being an 11-2 team. And fair or not, like a 2-loss conference loser, I don't think from the ACC or Big 12 is getting in. I don't know. I keep going back and forth on this. I think that Clemson would have had a better case for a couple of reasons as a potential 2-loss team if they lost close to Miami. I don't know that SMU has that case. So do you have a strong lean between SMU and Iowa State?
I'm in the same position because I agree. I think Notre Dame should at least be in our pool. But now comes the question, do we swap out Iowa State? And I think I lean towards SMU being the better of the two options, and they're very similar for those reasons. I think, for example, looking at the BYU game where SMU lost, defense helped them. They also had some real trouble in the red zone. Like the whole thing was but it was more of a defensive game. If they go into the ACC title game, it's not going to be a defensive game. Miami, I don't know if they can really even stop anybody if they need to. They can just put up a lot more points. I mean, they have talent. I mean, let me be clear. They have talent. They can definitely make defensive stops and cause a lot of chaos and havoc in the backfield. But if I'm comparing that to the likelihood of Iowa State winning out and having no trouble, I'm a little more leaning towards SMU at this point, because I think you're right. Both of those teams, which horse do I think has the best chance of making it all the way through unscathed? SMU seems to be getting better, and I think they certainly seem to have had less trouble overall. And they've got, I think, the better resume, because I think Louisville, while they fell out of the rankings, looks a little bit better now after what they did to Clemson. So I think, again, once again, in fact, I did Louisville climb back in. They're like number 25 in the AP, because I think people were like,
number 25.
Let's look at who they lost to. So I'm gonna go with, I think we should swap Iowa State out with SMU.
Okay. I think I'm good with that. I think I'm good with that. Now, again, these two teams I think could go back and forth to the end of the year, to be honest. But I think that that making that swap makes sense, and then adding Ohio State and Notre Dame. So we are actually flipping out 3 different teams this week, which is kind of crazy to think about.
It is, and I think next week we're gonna have a real discussion about whoever wins that LSU Alabama game, or how they win. It might be the other thing too. We might be like, wow, what were we even thinking about these?
I could definitely see
probably
that.
Unlikely. Probably unlikely.
Yeah. I will say both those teams already 2-loss teams. So look, and this probably transitions us a little bit to the second half of the episode, but it's going to be so fascinating to see how these 2-loss SEC teams are treated, because there are a lot of them.
Absolutely. Well, when we get back from the break, we got the inaugural CFP rankings coming up this week. We're going to give some of the big questions we're waiting to see answered when they do those rankings here on the College Football Survivor Show.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.
So as we said, Tuesday night, some other stuff going on around that might change the world map, but who cares about that? What we care about is what's going on in the college football map. And the inaugural CFP rankings, last episode, we talked a little bit about the discussion of how they're going to seed it and all of that stuff. We're not going to be seeing seeding. We're not going to see, I don't even know, are they going to even do a mock bracket? I couldn't see them doing that. That would be too weird I could see ESPN running with that, but I doubt the College Football Playoff Committee is going to do that. They're probably just going to go, here's our ranking. All of that said, this is the first time we've got a 12-team ranking here. I mean, we talked about this before, in the previous 10 years. We were very curious to see not necessarily who were the top 4, especially in the first ranking, but where the rest of the teams fell, because we knew that for some teams, there was really low chances of making it into the top 4. With 12 teams, especially, 11 of which are going to be probably closer to their rankings, plus, some years the G5 team may not be close to it, but this year with Boise State, if they win out, they're going to be part of it. But it's going to be a question of where do we place teams, who's going to be valuable. What are some of the things you're going to be looking for? And you've touched on it a bit so far, but what is another big thing you'll be looking for when we see the committee release its rankings?
Well, I think, so the biggest one, I want to point to the biggest thing first, and that is, where is Boise State? And there's a couple reasons for that. One, certainly you want to see just how far ahead of a team like Army, for example, is Boise State. Army's undefeated. Boise State a 1-loss team, but Boise State has better wins. How far are they ahead of Tulane or Louisiana or some of these other teams. So just frankly, how close or how far ahead is Boise State in the Group of Five race? We expect them to be at the top, but how far ahead? The other piece, though, is where is Boise State in relation to conference champions from the power conferences? For example, where are they in relation to Miami and BYU? And even more than that, where are they in relation to the teams that could pull upsets in the conference title games? SMU, Iowa State, Kansas State, obviously Colorado. I think that will be one of the most intriguing and important questions heading in is Boise State a team that's looking to punch up, or are they a team that's at risk of falling down? Because when you look at Boise State, I mean, I believe they're now number 12 in the AP Top 25. That would mean that they would at least have a chance to make the field as an actual at large and not just as a conference champion at large. Now, the pathway to that happening is pretty, because they'd have to lose the Mountain West, or Army would have to jump them into the top 10, most likely. But like, it makes it at least a conversation. It puts them in play for an at large. And I will say, the committee tends to not value Group of Five teams as much. Like, they tend to knock them down a little bit. I think back to Liberty versus SMU versus Tulane last year. Like, those teams were fighting in the 20s when even before the AP poll had Tulane closer to like the top 15. So maybe just when you look at some of these ratings and stuff like that, they won't hold up. But if you look at something like FPI, for example, Boise State is number 19. So they are a very legitimate top 20 team, no matter what you're looking at. So it'll be interesting from my perspective to see, like, are they closer to competing for the field against the other champions, or are they a team that's more in the thick of the Group of Five race?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that is one of the number one things to look for. It's certainly on my list, my short list. I'm very curious to see who the first two-loss team is that they place and where they place them. And I'm assuming it's going to be an SEC or Big Ten team, probably an SEC team. But I'm very curious to see where they rank it. And I'm just going to kind of add this in against a team like. Well, no, I'm not going to say Indiana. I'm also curious to see where they're going to rank. Those two are kind of almost, because I'm like, I'm waiting to see them rank Indiana behind like a two-loss SEC team just to raise hackles like everywhere. But I'm curious to see how that shapes up. So I'm not sure. I mean, do we think they're going to put any in the top 12? I think there's a couple of teams that might make it. Or do you think we'll see them stick to undefeated and one-loss teams in that initial ranking, at least in the top 12?
So I want to transition this actually to my other point, which is I'm really curious how they handle two-loss SEC teams, because there are a whole lot of them. You talk about Alabama, you talk about Ole Miss, which is a team that's pretty low in the other rankings, but they rate pretty well in analytics systems. You talk about LSU, a team who I frankly think is kind of unserious, but still manages to push their way into these conversations. Like, how many of these teams are going to be on the precipice, for example, of being top 10, top 12 teams? Because when you talk about teams that are contending for those at-large spots, like, there's only a certain amount of 0 and 1-loss teams left. And all of a sudden you're in conversations for teams like, SMU versus Alabama, or LSU versus Tennessee, or, all this sort of stuff. And I don't know how they're going to handle it. From my perspective, like, you look at some of the losses that these SEC teams have taken, they're crazy, right? Like how can you sit here and LSU lost to USC, and we can say USC's playing better now, but they lost to USC. That's not necessarily a great loss. Tennessee, even as a one-loss team, they lost to Arkansas. Alabama, of course, that loss to Vanderbilt doesn't feel quite as bad, but it's not awesome either. And so I'm curious, like, and actually, Ole Miss losing to Kentucky might be the worst loss out of all of these. Like, that is such a bad loss. Kentucky looks like a disaster right now. So I'm curious, right? Are these teams going to be jumbled from like 9 to 13, or are they going to be scattered from like 10 to 25? Because again, when I look at Ole Miss, And Ole Miss is going to have a chance to prove themselves this week. Nothing that Ole Miss has done to this point is deserving or befitting of a college football playoff team. It's just not. And I'll be curious to see, does the committee put more onus on maybe some of this power rating type stuff, or do they look more at resume? And I think that, for example, like, what's the case for a team like Boise State or SMU to be behind Alabama right now, right? What is the case even to go to a one-loss team? What's the case for BYU to be behind Tennessee when BYU has a win over a top 15 SMU and a top 20 Kansas State? That's, I think, going to be the most telling thing, is just how much respect are these two-loss teams getting? Because it's kind of the difference between the SEC maybe putting 3 into the field and pushing for like 5.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious to see if we see a jumble, because I think it's easier to sort out the teams that are ahead of them, the teams that are behind them. But right now, the SEC has kind of created this jumble because too many of the teams have lost games that we didn't really expect, or are one-loss teams, and all the top teams seem to have lost now to, at least all the teams have lost somebody at this point. There is no undefeated team in the conference, let alone overall. I'd be curious to see. They will. I wonder how much the conference is going. Pardon me, how much the CFP is going to put on. Some of these teams will sort themselves out in short order, because obviously, as you mentioned, we get Ole Miss hosting Georgia. We're going to know real quick if Ole Miss should be even part of this conversation anymore. I could see them. This kind of goes into my other question: is who are the bubble teams in this situation? We were always looking at 5 and 6, and they would make that big drama in the previous iterations of the CFP ranking show. But when you're talking about 12 teams, one of which is going to be a G5 champ, which in years other than this one would potentially be someone just not even close to the top of the ranking. I'm very curious to see who they're going to put like 12 through 18, and then kind of putting a bigger picture on this. We always were hearing conversations in this first ranking of, teams that were at below X ranking have never made it into that top 4. Well, we've got 12 spots. I'm very curious to see. I mean, we're going to keep track of this ranking in the long run. I'm very curious, and this is a longer term thing. Are we going to see, if not this season and a future season, some team that wasn't even in this ranking somehow make it in just because of a great final stretch run, maybe a couple of upsets, and they get their way into the conference title game and work their way in? Or who knows? And I'm not saying, again, the G5 may have that, but I'm talking about just one of the P4. I wonder if we'll get that kind of opportunity.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. And I mean, look, one experiment that I wanted to do, maybe after the rankings come out this week, is literally going through and saying, how many teams have a like literal, like humanly possible path to making the college football playoff? Because if you start asking, like, okay, when things get crazy, how many ACC teams, for example, could find their way into that second spot? Or how many Big 12 teams have like an insane mathematical shot of making it in? Like, it's going to be more than we think. And I think that that's, again, I've heard over and over again, and I think that Rich Clark mentioned it, the executive director of the CFP, on last week's call, that look, this is the point. We want 30 to 40 teams heading into November with the thought of at least, well, we're still alive. Like, there's still a chance. It might not be a great chance, but who cares? Like, you want something to play for. I actually got to ask SMU coach Rhett Lashley about this after the game this past week. And he was kind of like, look, the reality is, like, to be able to tell kids, regardless, like, you are still alive, your goals are still in front of you, and you control your own destiny, even though you lost in week 2, that's a huge deal. It makes it, in some ways, easier to keep your kids engaged as well, to say your goals are still in front of you. No, now, look, I get the idea of like, well, nobody wants games to mean less, but think about the SMU BYU game. Think about how consequential it actually is because it happened, because BYU now has that win, because SMU had to fight their way all the way back from that loss. I don't think that made that game any less consequential. If anything, I think it made it more consequential because of its downstream impact. So I'm really fascinated to see that. And I also want to touch on this. Like, I want to see specifically, how does the committee handle the threesome of Miami, Indiana, and BYU? Because these are 3 teams that are all undefeated. Miami right now in the AP is number 4. Indiana's 8, BYU's 9. If you look at the teams that they've beaten and the quality wins that they have, BYU clearly has the best of the bunch. Like, clearly. Indiana has been the most dominant team of the bunch. Miami has been really good, but they've played with their food a lot. They have one top 25 victory against Louisville. And other than that, they kind of are coasting off of the preseason expectations that they had. Now, I was one of the people, and you were one of the people putting together those preseason expectations. We thought that they were going to win the ACC and have a chance at the playoffs. But, like, I'm curious, does the committee sit back and say, when we're comparing 3 undefeated teams in power conferences, like, are we going to take seriously the fact that potentially the one who has the best resume is not the one who we thought was going to be in the field?
Yeah, that's going to be another big factor in this. And this is something that comes up year after year. And I do sympathize with a lot of the folks who find a problem with this. How much is brand name going to influence some of these placements? Now, in the end, I know the committee in their heart of hearts knows that things will work their way out, like especially with some of these undefeated teams. Like if you can make it all the way, don't worry, you'll be in. I mean, they don't have the same problem they did last year, that's for sure. But in my heart of hearts, I do wonder if they're going to be looking at some of these brands, not just because they're not in the P4 in the SEC. Well, maybe the SEC. Will the SEC get some kind of bonus? I am not that impressed by the SEC. I kind of wasn't earlier on, and I said this earlier. I'm like, are we giving them credit for because if everyone's in the same pack, no one's really sticking out, and maybe some of these teams that were playing at the beginning weren't the best of the bunch. I mean, we'll see, but I'm very curious to see how that will go its way. It's interesting you mentioned, as I said, they wanted around 30 teams kind of in this play. David Hale, great guy, writes for ESPN, really fun Twitter follow, I have to say. But he did this thing with like being generous. There are 33 teams still in the race to make it into these 12 spots. How wonderful is that? We just wrapped up week 10. And there's still, realistically, maybe not totally 33, but there's still teams that you could see it. Crazy stuff has happened before, certainly.
Let's close with this real quick. Every year, we tend to do a post rankings reaction show, and we're going to do that tomorrow. We're going to get one out to you on Tuesday night. Nothing else going on, so I'm sure you're going to listen to it right away, of course. But every year, there is one thing that happens that just drives me insane. I think last year it was the SEC versus Florida State thing, the way that they were disrespected. Like every year there's something. So I'll answer first. But I want to ask, what do you think is going to be the thing that makes me lose my mind and go on a rant? Because it's going to happen tomorrow. I think that my answer is they're going to rank BYU like number 14. They're going to rank them behind multiple 2-loss SEC teams with better wins than almost all of them, and they're still going to put them into the middle of the field, and they're going to cite like, well, when you look at things like power metrics and things like that, and when you look at their overall strength of schedule, even though they've played good teams, that's why. And that's going to make me lose my ever-living mind when like Alabama's number 7 and BYU's number 14. So what do you think it's going to be that makes me lose my mind tomorrow?
I actually think Boise State's going to be ranked far lower than anyone expects. I think people are they're going to almost act like Ashton Genty's kind of an afterthought. And they're going to say like, yeah, they had an opportunity and Oregon was just early on. It was early in the season. It wasn't that big of a deal. And they're going to disrespect them. And we're going to see the fact that the G5 team is not in the top, even close to the top 12. And that will drive everyone bonkers, especially because we're going to feel like, who are these folks? And no disrespect, the committee's actually a lot of great people, but I mean, it'll drive some people wild. It's going to be like, what do they need to do, guys? What do they need to do? I mean, and I would be surprised if Army's even ranked. To be entirely honest, I will be shocked if they're even part of the conversation because they seem to be a little bit harder.
I get it, but that would be crazy to me if Army is not ranked.
Yeah. So, well, we'll see. We're going to get an opportunity as you are. It'll be a fun show. We're going to put this out there as soon as we can. We're going to be doing it pretty soon, right after the rank. We're going to record it pretty soon after the ranking show is done. You can maybe use it as a way to kind of escape from the other nonsense that might be going on around you. It'll be a fun conversation about college football, a sport we all love. Just as a quick reminder, Our current Survivor Island comprises Oregon, Georgia, Ohio State, Miami, Texas, Penn State, Tennessee, BYU, Notre Dame, SMU, Indiana, and Boise State. We'll see if those are the 12 we get or if we'll get some others here on the College Football Survivor Show when we get back to you in our next episode. Before we take off, I just wanted to thank all of you for listening. Thank our producer, Joey Aliberti. Be sure to like, rate, and subscribe to us wherever you get your podcasts. You can find us on X and TikTok at CFB Survivor Show. He's Shehan Jayaraja in the dark because the power went out halfway through the show. You can find his work at cbssports.com and at Shehan Jayaraja on X and TikTok. I'm Bobak here in the bright lights of wonderful Minnesota where it snowed on Halloween. Thanks for listening, everybody. Take care.
The College Football Survivor Show, where playoff survival is always on the line.